Oh, hello. Welcome to another video. Today we're going to be looking at the last in my Kill Team Basics series. We're going to be looking at line of sight, and it is a difficult topic. So, line of sight is the game to a great extent, and that's why in my first slide there in the title page there were these quotation marks around the word basics. It is a basic in that you do need to understand it to be able to play, but it really is also where the high level play exists in Kill Team. It is very complicated. It's much more complicated than other war games, and I don't always get it right. If I'm playing an event especially, I'm the kind of player that will just let my opponent dictate whether or not he's got a line of sight and whether or not I've got line of sight, because I don't feel like I have a strong enough grasp on the rules to sort of challenge my opponent a lot of the time. That's one of my weaknesses when I'm playing. I always tend to assume that my opponent has a better and a tighter grasp on the rules than I do. This is not, I'm going down a sidetrack now. This is not me saying I think that most opponents are out to try and swindle and win through kind of just being forceful and getting their way. I don't think that at all. I think people are kind of inherently biased towards interpreting situations in a favourable way. And so they genuinely believe they have line of sight when maybe they don't, and likewise they might genuinely believe you don't have line of sight when maybe you do. So I'm not the expert, and it's something I find really difficult to get my head around a lot of the time, but I am a teacher by trade, so I'm going to take a stab at trying to explain it, not least because by explaining something, you actually embed the knowledge yourself better and understand it more thoroughly. So the first concept we have to think about, okay, the first keyword, key term if you like, is visibility. So the visibility, in some games, the entire line of sight system will be what we're going to describe here as visibility. Visibility is, can the shooting model see the enemy model? So you get right down and squint behind the model that is shooting, and can you draw a line from the shooting model's head to any part of the model it wants to shoot? It could be the tip of a wing, the tip of a sword, a fingernail, doesn't matter. Can you see any part of the model that you want to shoot? If you can, it's visible. Now that's very, very permissive. I mean, and that is one of the reasons why the Chalnath Pathfinder team is doing so well, because they skip a lot of the rest of the things that we're going to look at if they have enough marker lights, but that's another video. Okay, visibility is just very, very basic. Do you have the ability to draw that line from the shooting model's head to any part on the enemy model, no matter how trivial it might be? Now we've got to introduce the concept of cover lines. So cover lines are imaginary lines drawn from any point on the active operative base to every point on the intended target space. That's what the rulebook says, every point on the intended target space. You'll often see them expressed as two cover lines, like a cone like this, okay? But we're looking at the entire area of the cone, not just the two lines. A really good way of doing these, and again, this isn't an advert, this is just something I use and find really useful, is the Army Painter Target Lock Laser Line. It looks like a laser pointer, but it's got a filter on the end to, it actually projects a line down on the table from above. And you can very easily establish where these cover lines are so that you can see where your kind of cover cone is, I guess, that's made up of all your cover lines. Now it's worth saying that in my example here, the blue circle is trying to fire at the orange circle, and I've drawn some cover lines on there in red. Now, but they can come from any part of the blue model's base, so you could have an alternative set of cover lines, if you excuse the fact that my hand is a bit wobbly. The green cover lines there, if you imagine they were straight, those could also be your cover lines if you had a piece of terrain, like this, that you wanted to avoid. You could draw the cover lines like I have in the green example and avoid that piece of terrain altogether. Okay, so it doesn't have to be from both sides of the blue model to both sides of the orange model, just from any point chosen by the firer on the firing model's base. Okay, those are your cover lines. So now we look at the next term. I know it's a lot to take in, but I will try and sum it up at the end. Obscuring. If the intended target is more than white from a point at which a cover line crosses heavy terrain, it is obscured. So you have to be more than white away from the heavy terrain to be obscured. That can seem really counterintuitive to a lot of players. Okay, because if you kind of want to hunker your models down behind the terrain to make them feel really safe. But if you're within that 2-inch white range, you are not obscured by the heavy terrain. Think about windows. Think about it this way. If you imagine a ruin, really common piece of terrain, with a window in, if you have a model that's right up in that window, you should be able to try and shoot him. Yeah, he gets the benefits of cover, which we'll talk about in a minute, but you should be able to attempt to shoot him. Whereas if that model is quite far away and you're quite far away and the ruin is in the middle, it's reasonable to say it would be impossible to take a shot such that it would go through that window, bearing in mind that in the game of Kill Team, we're abstracting away the fact that the models are constantly in motion, right? It becomes a nearly impossible shot. Now, there is a caveat. If a shooting model is within black, so there's 1-inch black triangle of a point at which the cover line crosses heavy terrain, that section does not obscure the shot. Now, it's really important that you understand this, so I'm going to draw on this to give you a few other examples. So you've got the grey piece of heavy terrain there. So in the current example, before I draw anything, the orange model, the target, is obscured. At least according to these cover lines. I could draw different cover lines, but according to these cover lines, he's obscured, right? Now, we could imagine that this was a big miniaturum container. So if we extend it like this, okay, you might think that now he's not obscured because he's within circle of the piece of terrain, the piece of heavy terrain. But notice what it says, from a point at which a cover line crosses heavy terrain. So he's within circle of this point, but he's not within circle of this point or this point. So when you have a significantly big piece of terrain, you don't have to be circle away from the whole thing. You just have to be circle away from essentially the furthest away point where the cover line crosses the terrain. Right? If we make this even bigger though, so now it's like a massive toy train or something, I don't know. The blue model might like to think he can ignore that, but he can't. Okay? Even though he's within 1 inch, he's within black of the piece of terrain, he can only ignore the section that he is within 1 inch of. He can't ignore the whole thing. So in other words, when you have big bulky pieces of terrain, they greatly favour the target model, okay? Because the target model only has to be more than circle away from any point at which a cover line crosses the heavy terrain, okay? Whereas the firing model has to have the whole thing within 1 inch to ignore it. It can only ignore the stuff that's within that 1 inch bubble. This is part of the reason that I sometimes feel that Kill Team plays better on tables where the terrain is all quite thin, like the Octarius terrain, where it's all that sort of thin barricades or thin walls, or mostly, and it can get a little bit strange sometimes when you have loads of like Minotaur containers. But as long as you're aware of the rules and you understand them, obscuring heavy terrain works pretty well. It is just that initial sort of brain jump where you think if your model is hunkered down right behind the heavy terrain, that must be where it's safest. It's not. You need to be a little bit away from it. You need to be more than circle away from a point at which the cover line crosses the heavy terrain. Okay. Next concept we want to talk about is cover. So we've had obscuring, now we're talking about cover. So if the intended target is within 1 inch, is within black of a point at which a cover line crosses another model's base or heavy or light terrain, it is in cover. Unless the shooting model is within circle of its target. When you get into that really close range, then your opponent can never claim to be in cover, okay? But you're practically in combat at that point. You're just 2 inches away, okay? So if the shooting model is within 2 inches, then they could ignore the idea of cover, that you never get any cover, okay? So the status of being in cover has different effects depending on what order the intended target has. If you've played any kill team, you're going to be familiar with the concept of orders. If you're on an engage order, you can shoot and charge and take aggressive actions. If you're on a conceal order, you can't shoot or charge. Okay? But if you're on a conceal order and you have this status of being in cover, because you're within black of a point at which a cover line crosses another model's base or heavy or light terrain, then you can't be shot. Effectively, it's as if you are obscured. It's not the same as being obscured, you simply can't be shot. If a target with an engage order is in cover, it gets a different effect. It gets to retain one of its 3 defense dice that it would roll as an automatic success without rolling it. Now, you could still choose to roll it if you wanted to fish for critical defense rolls, but you can retain one of your dice as an automatic success. Okay. Now, putting it all together. Okay. So if you want to shoot something, the first thing you've got to ask yourself is the target visible? Can I draw that imaginary line from my shooting model's head to any point on the target model? If you can't shoot it. Once you're sure that it's visible, you're going to have to ask yourself, is the target obscured? Okay, does it have a piece of heavy terrain that intersects the cover line that's more than circle away from the target? Okay, and more than black away from the shooting model. If it is obscured, then you can't shoot. Is it in cover? If it's not in cover, you can shoot it, no problem. If it's in cover, you have to ask, does the target have a conceal order? If it has a conceal order and it's in cover, it can't be shot. If it doesn't have a conceal order, so therefore it has an engage order, then it can be shot, but you do get to retain 1 dice as an automatic save. Okay. Now, we've talked a lot about cover, and I can't, even though it's not really part of line of sight, I can't touch on cover without talking a little bit about Vantage. So Vantage is an effect where you're up on a piece of high up terrain. So think about those Octarius ruins. When you're up on the roof, you're on a vantage point. We define that piece of terrain as having vantage. And when you're on a terrain feature that you've defined as having vantage, and you're at least circle higher than your intended target, that target is treated as having an engage order if it is in cover provided by light terrain or another operative. Right? Now, I want to read that again because this is such a massive gotcha. I'm going to talk about gotchas a little bit on the next slide anyway. Vantage only interacts with the cover status when that cover is provided by light terrain or another operative, not when the cover is provided by heavy terrain or by an ability. So if you're on Vantage and your opponent is on a conceal order and behind light cover or another friendly model, a friendly operative, then you can treat them as being on an engage order. Notice as well that you don't cancel the cover altogether. They're treated as being on an engage order, so they still get that benefit of an automatic save, but you can at least now target them and shoot them. So there's a couple of gotchas to look out for. Actually, there's quite a few. So I've mentioned some of these as we're going along. Containers. Sometimes you have large sections of heavy terrain. These often tend to benefit the target, as I discussed earlier, and they're also explicitly called out in the Kill Team FAQ over on the Warhammer community website. If you are within circle of a piece of terrain, then you're not obscured. But if you're only within circle of part of that piece of terrain, and the part that you're not within circle of is still intersecting the cover line, then you can still claim to be obscured. Meanwhile, if you're within triangle of a piece of heavy terrain, it doesn't obscure your shot. But if that piece of terrain extends outside that 1-inch bubble, then it still obscures your shot if it crosses the cover line. Okay? The next gotcha is a concept called the danger zone. It's possible to be too close to heavy terrain to be obscured, but too far to be away to count as being in cover. Yeah? Because if you're further away from 1 inch, yeah, but closer than 2 inches, so you're 1.5 inches away from a piece of heavy terrain, that piece of heavy terrain is doing nothing for you. It's not giving you the benefit of cover because you're not within 1 inch of it, but it's not giving you the benefit of obscuring because you're closer than 2 inches, right? Don't find yourself in the danger zone. A massive gotcha. Another idea is the idea of peeking, where you can position your model like just round a corner or some other way using the terrain where you can shoot out quite happily, but you can't be shot back. Because of the way the cover lines are drawn from a single point on the shooting model's base to both sides of the model, the base of the model that they're attacking, the line of sight rules are not reciprocal like they are in 40k and in some other tabletop games where you can just say, oh, well, you just shot me, so now I'm going to activate the model you just shot and I can shoot you back. It doesn't work that way. Okay, you have to work through the flowchart each time. There's no kind of automatic idea that you're going to be able to shoot back. Okay. And finally, on heavy cover, Vantage only affects light terrain or intervening models. It doesn't affect heavy terrain or some other sources of cover like the particular Sisters of Battle Act of Faith that lets you counter model as being in cover. When I pointed this out to Zimbad, he made an extremely cross face. He, at one point, I don't know if he still does think this, he at one point thought that was an oversight and it will be sorted out in the FAQ for Chalnath, which we think is coming. I personally don't think it's an oversight. At the moment, rules as written, that act of faith is grouped in with heavy terrain as things that aren't affected by Vantage, and it's not grouped in with light terrain and intervening models as being one of the things that is affected by Vantage. This has been one of the most complicated parts of the game, and it's been a challenge for me to get my head around and explain. There's loads of other really good explanation videos for the line of sight and kill team out there on the internet. I know that Glass Half Dead has done one. I think Tabletop Skirmish Games has done one. And there are some others as well that I'm probably forgetting. There are quite a lot. I hope this has helped. If you go and try and watch and absorb some more of those videos, and crucially, play some games and get some practice in, and picking up one of those Army Painter laser lines will help as well, then eventually you'll get your head around line of sight and it will become intuitive. I'm still not quite there yet to the point where it's totally intuitive, okay? It is so much more complicated than it is for 40k. Because in things like, I'm actually not too familiar with 9th edition, I've played about one game of it, but certainly at some point in 40k, the entire of the line of sight rules were basically the visibility portion of the kill team line of sight rules, and that was it, okay? It's great to be back making videos after the Christmas break. I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you found it useful, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, wherever you are and whatever you're doing. Thanks everybody.